Good evening, everyone. My name is Dennis Kratz, and I'm here to greet you as the director of the Center for Asian Studies at the University of Texas at Dallas. We have a treat in store this evening, a fireside chat, a discussion about what it's like to live in another person's country. We have three participants that I'd like to introduce very, very briefly. They represent different aspects of being an expatriate living in another person's land. The first, I'd like to introduce Noah Lipnick. Noah has extensive experience working in Asia and foreign lands, but more importantly for us, he has just moved to Texas from an exotic foreign land with very different culture than we have in Texas. Yes, he's come from California and moved to San Diego. Welcome, Noah. Also here is Lauren Menkemeller. Lauren is one of the typically cool people who come to take our community language classes. She's a private pilot. She studied in Japan, and while continuing her pilot training is enrolled in and helping to facilitate the conversational Japanese class that the center offers to the community. Welcome, Lauren, and to repeat your greeting that you gave in your little introduction in our newsletter. Hi, y'all. And Iris Wu. Iris is an expatriate from another country living in the United States. She's a citizen of China, and she is living in, I think it's Plano that you're living in, Iris. Am I close?
Richardson. I'm living on campus.
She's living, she's living in Richardson on campus. She received her high school degree here in Texas. And now, as she just mentioned, she's an undergraduate. She's majoring in literature. And I'm not going to embarrass Iris by praising her. I'm simply going to state a fact or two about her. She's very smart. She's very imaginative. And she's a superior student. So she took and I say that from experience because Iris was a student last semester in my literature class. And to moderate, I'm pleased to welcome, at least virtually, to the Richardson campus, Dr. John Brender, who serves as the Director of Special Initiatives for the Office of International Programs at Wayne State University. It's rare that I get to introduce someone to whom I feel an immediate affinity. John and I became involved with China, at least in programming at the same time, in 2008 in fact, and both of us with the program known as the Confucius Institute. John directed the Confucius Institute at Wayne State for 13 years, and from 2007 or 8 until 2019, as dean, I was responsible for the Confucius Institute at UT Dallas, and I know that both of us found it a remarkably important and educationally valuable experience. And to adapt his phrase, we both feel that we were our institute's chief student of Chinese culture during that time. Among many significant contributions to international and cross-cultural understanding, through his personal experience, his studies, and numerous interviews, he produced the book that he'll talk about for a few minutes this evening, Millennial Expats in China. I've read it. I recommend it wholeheartedly and whole-mindedly to everyone if you are interested in what it's like to be the foreigner in someone else's land. With that, I'm going to turn it over to John. It's a fireside chat, and we've asked him to speak for a few minutes about the book and his views on expatriate living, and then turn it over to him and the 3 participants, and after that, to everyone who's involved, I hope will become a participant. John Brender, welcome to UT Dallas.
Well, thank you very much. And you'll notice that I downloaded this fake fireplace background just for the occasion. So let me bring in my PowerPoint here. And I was promised 10 minutes, so I will do everything in my power to keep it there. Everybody sees the screen okay? Hello?
Here's a yes.
Yes, okay. Just want to make sure I have a little feedback. I'm not used to talking without being interrupted, but I'll try. So first I want to start by saying that, why did I write this? I mean, aside from the fact that I really believe in, cross-cultural experiences and study abroad, I wrote this because I had access to a lot of expats, a lot of people who had been through Wayne State and other schools that I had met in my journeys to China. And so I had ready access to talk to people and sort of figure out what their experiences are so that I could relate them with other people, okay? And the second reason, of course, is to share their experiences with others. And third is I just wanted to provide informed insights about China, because I feel that far too much of the information that we have about China tends to come through very filtered, political and news stations. And I wanted to give people an idea of what China is, right? And a little bit more extensively. So who's my audience? Okay, as I was writing this, I was not writing this for the Sinophile. I was not writing this for necessarily the scholars. This is for people who are current and future sojourners, and probably most importantly, concerned family members, because all of us who studied abroad probably had a couple of parents who worried about where we were going, what we were, getting into, and so on and so forth. So I wrote this largely to try to calm their nerves. And then, of course, I wrote this for anybody who has a healthy interest in China. Here are the chapters in my book. I separated it more or less into 2 parts. The first is personal experiences. And so each of these chapters more or less constitutes a question that I asked people. So after introducing the individuals, I talked about their prior impressions, what they thought about China before they ever went there. Then, of course, what are your first impressions? And then after a while, what are your more seasoned impressions or changing impressions? Today, I'm going to talk about personal changes, what people felt, or how people felt China had changed them after being there for a while. And I have people who were there anywhere from 18 months to 11 years, but the vast majority were there between, say, 4 and 6 years, okay? I have a chapter devoted to language learning and those who are successful and the pitfalls of not learning or, stagnating. There's a chapter on meeting Chinese people and another on meeting international people. And then on stratifying internationals, what kind of international people do you meet in China? And then what do you do with your free time? So there was a chapter on that. After that, I got into basic observations of Chinese families, K-12 education, university education, Chinese men, Chinese women, and overall impressions, okay? So I thought that was a pretty reasonable way to introduce China to the less initiated. So personal changes, you see that no pain, no gain kind of a thing. What we found were that people said they attained independence and responsibility as a result of being in China. Greater resilience, boldness coupled with patience. And this was something that took me a few days to completely figure out. We'll talk about that in a bit. Empathy. People felt that they gained empathy. Passive acceptance. Some people may not think that's a great thing, but we'll talk about that. And changes in religious or worldview perspectives that tended to go in every imaginable direction. Okay, so I'll briefly touch on each of these personal changes. First was independence and responsibility, and a lot of my book is filled with quotes because I really wanted this to be about the expats themselves, and I sort of moderate this and maybe try to make heads or tails out of things people are saying, but you'll find a lot of quotes. And so here's one. There was a young woman from Detroit who said, "It really forced me to become an adult in ways that I probably would have gotten to, just slower if I had never gone to China. But China really did jumpstart that because I had to learn the language. I had to learn the cultural ins and outs and also the subcultures." Okay, moving right along. Resilience was a huge part of living in China. Now, I cannot guarantee that you will become more resilient by being in China, but I remember as I was doing this research that I read an article in the Atlantic about the anxious child, right? And to sum it up, the takeaway is that children shielded from challenging situations were more likely to develop and suffer from anxiety later in life. So while this is not necessarily a panacea, what I discovered from my respondents was that by being in China, by having to find a way to express themselves despite, limited language skills, how to take a bus when you really don't know that much Chinese, how to find your way back when you don't really read that many signs, how you deal with things that are just so completely different every day, every minute, and to deal with that sort of stress. So a lot of people felt that their experience in China made them far more resilient. So I had quotes such as one that sounded like eerily similar to something Frank Sinatra said. "If I can survive here, I feel like I can kind of survive anywhere else. I can live on my own or navigate through life." So a lot of people saw this as a real test of their ability to just get through difficult periods. Another quote on resilience. This was a young man in his early 30s now married to a Chinese national and living in the Detroit area. He says, "You learn a lot from the work ethic of the students in China and the teachers in China. They do work hard. They try hard. I've always been a little bit spoiled. You kind of see that people in the US are a little bit spoiled. And you can kind of push yourself to points maybe you wouldn't be able to get to before." Okay, another resilience quote, and this comes from a woman who is Feng American, and she also married a Chinese national and lives currently in Wuhan. And she says, regarding her Chinese in-laws, "In this countryside, everything they do it by hand. They made shoes by hand, and they were showing me this ladder that my husband's grandpa made, and everything was by hand. And they have this little small yard, and they plant tomatoes, and they have this pear tree, and everyone's always coming to visit them." Okay, I can tell you, having been to China several times, I have seen people, especially in the countryside, who do amazing things. A 60-year-old man carrying a small bamboo tree on his shoulder with flip-flops and a cigarette, and I'm in fairly good shape and wearing mountain hiking boots and still struggling. So you see some amazing things when you get to the countryside. Here's something: boldness coupled with patience. So people felt that if they'd never been bold before, they found that there were times that they had to be, but there were also times that they realized that they had to be patient. And so there was a learning curve in terms of learning when to be one or the other, right? So a woman from California who teaches English at a kindergarten in Wuhan said, "I think that I handled conflicts a lot better. I didn't like confrontation, and I didn't like to stand up for myself when I knew something was wrong." And that's happened several times. And so I've learned to really face things head on and learn when to jump in and when to fight for myself and not always jump the gun and straight away be angry about the situation. Okay, empathy. And this was from a former college athlete from Minnesota. And he had this to say. He said, "Before I went to China, even at the prep school and where I did my undergrad, both places had a pretty significant international student population. And I was friends with them, but never bridged the gap to really connect with them until I went to China and was a foreigner myself and had that real experience as the outsider. And so that was really pivotal and gave me more empathy or a softer heart when I came back to really relate with them. Okay, this is a common thing that I heard from other people, from my respondents. Passive acceptance. This is from a gentleman from Detroit who has been in China for 8 years and had this revelation to share. He said, for the first year or so, I was a dumb, arrogant American. Why doesn't China do it this way? But later, I realized just because they do it differently doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means that it's different. And I need to drink a nice tall glass of shut the bleep up and just change how I react to the situation. And once I did that, things got better. Dropping those expectations just made me realize, okay, this is fun. This is actually not a bad way to live. And then regarding religion, we had everything. I had someone from the Bahamas who was from a Pentecostal background who felt that he lost his religion because once he was sort of challenged on ideas and rethought things, that he changed his perspective. There was another woman, a Hmong American woman from outside of Detroit, who became a born-again Christian because of some of the other foreign students that she met who invited her to church, and she took that on. There were people who were heavily into Taoism and enjoyed that aspect. Some were trying to get into Buddhism, but were sometimes disappointed because they didn't find a lot of other people who shared their beliefs or ideas. But the lower middle is apparently the international sign for agnosticism, and that tended to be maybe half of the respondents. They were open to different religions, but they were not necessarily following any particular religion, but still open and willing to have conversations about all kinds of things, and maybe spiritual oftentimes in their own way. I have not kept my eye on the clock, but I hope that is within 10 minutes. So just a quick review. The things that my respondents reported having gained as a result of being in China, and these are my 20 respondents, it doesn't necessarily mean it will be everyone, are independence and responsibility, resilience, boldness coupled with patience, empathy, passive acceptance, and changes in religious or worldview perspectives. Okay, 谢谢. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, John. I'd like to see if the participants now can get the conversation started, learn from John, and see how many people who've tuned in have something to say.
Okay, I'm unmuted now. Was I unmuted when I spoke? I was unmuted. Okay, I just saw somebody say I was muted. I don't know. I'm not sure how that happened.
Okay, I guess I'll probably start with asking Dr. Brender a little question. So you mentioned about the learning of another language, and I also experienced this process of learning English. Again, actually, I went through this deconstruction and then reconstruction process for learning English. And then I'm just wondering, from your study and your experience or the experience of people that you know, what is the role of language versus culture? So for some people that I know, they think of language as a tool for getting to know the culture, for getting to know the people. And for other people, they think that the language itself, the culture is inherited in the language. So what is your perception on this matter?
Wow, that can be really deep. I mean, language and culture are inextricable in a lot of ways, right? And I think in a more extreme example, and I think Lauren would agree, is Japanese, where, you know, just based on the person you speak with, you need to change your verb, you change your pronouns, right? The pronoun for I, the pronoun for you, the way you talk to a person, how you speak to them. You really, in order to get into a culture, I think the language is imperative, right? You know, I think Nelson Mandela said something like, you know, speak to a person in their speak to a person in your language, you speak to their brain, but speak to a person in their language and you speak to their heart, right? So yes, I mean, there's so many things that I could talk about. For example, in Spanish, the fact that if I say something, I need to say it 3 times. When I write an essay, I have to reiterate things, which goes against all of the rules that I've had to learn in English, right? I don't blame myself in Spanish. I don't say I lost the keys. I say the keys were lost on me, right? So there's so many things in a language that are indicative of the people that you are working with and meeting every single day. So absolutely, the language has an enormous aspect of understanding the culture, of course. And the more you understand the culture, the more you make modifications in your language, and so on and so forth. So you can get a feel of a culture by being there and maybe by speaking your own language, but I don't think you really truly feel and experience it the way you would once you speak a language. The other thing is you are afforded the ability to speak not just with the elite or the intelligentsia, right? I can speak Japanese with, everyday shopkeepers and people of every level and children and so on and so forth. So that makes my experience so much deeper. I'm not limited to college professors, right? So I hope that kind of answers what you're getting at. If there's anything more specific, please let me know.
Yeah, definitely. So the reason why I was mentioning this topic is because my mom, so she is a very good English speaker. And then one time she has this very interesting comment. She said, because she studied law, and she was saying, it is easier for me to speak in those legal terms than to speak to, for example, a waitress in a restaurant. So I think that's very interesting.
Well,
And I'm sorry.
I had a colleague from Wuhan who was a chair of her Department of English at Huazhong Kujidashi, right? And, her English is wonderful. She can say anything she wants. But, I became extremely aware of, a lot of little things that I would say. For example, if I made a reference to Captain Kangaroo, all the Americans would immediately say, oh, that's a children's show host from the 50s through the 80s. But the Chinese people would have no idea what I was talking about, right? So there are a lot of really small references and a lot of slang, a lot of sports slang that we use. And I would be involved with her in a conversation, and afterwards she would ask me all kinds of questions. And I didn't always realize just how culturally laden, our expressions are, or the references, or if I talk about Saturday Night Live in a skit, I mean, that's not something that a person usually from Asia is going to grasp, right? So there's a lot of those cultural things beyond just open the door, pass the salt, and your basic language competence. You really need to understand the history and the pop culture and maybe the sports and the metaphors, and it goes on and on. And just in case, I'm going to give a little plug to, we have a YouTube channel called Learn a Chinese Phrase with 168 different Chinese phrases that Americans would never know, like xiao qi gui, or, like how would you know to call somebody who's a cheapskate a little air ghost, right? It makes no sense. But you need to start to understand what all of the implications are in language. He let my pigeon go means he ghosted me. Why? Because it means when people were sending carrier pigeons back and forth, one day somebody didn't send the carrier pigeon back, and you say, oh, you let my pigeon go, right? So you could hear this in Chinese, but have no idea what it means. So the longer you're there, the more you hear the language, the more you understand, where they come from and what the people are about. So yes, language and culture, inextricable.
I have a comment. So clearly, culture shock is a two-way street. It sounds like the interaction you had with the woman regarding Captain Kangaroo, that was a culture shock more on the receiving end for her. Being unfamiliar with everything American.
Mm-hmm.
And likewise, in my experience living in China and other countries, I was also on the receiving end of a lot of, as you can probably relate, of, idioms and slang and ways of doing things. What other facets of culture shock did you experience in other countries? Not only China, but in other cultures and regarding language and, you know, popular culture. Can you speak to that?
Absolutely. My problem is I'll speak too much. So shut me up when I overdo it. And I'm sure Lauren will relate with this. When I lived in Japan, everything I did for 2 years was wrong. And, you know, one of the biggest differences between the Chinese and the Japanese is that, you know, and then these are real broad strokes, and I mean this to be humorous. In Japan, everything matters. In China, nothing matters. It's like Meguanshi versus everything I did. I mean, I would walk into a building. If I'd walk into a building, I had to take my shoes off, put them in a box, put the slippers on, walk down the hall, take the slippers off to go to the tatami room, leave the tatami room, put the slippers on, walk to the bathroom, leave the slippers on the outside, put on the clogs. When I finish, take off the clogs, put on the slippers, go to the tatami room, take off the slippers. I mean, all of these things, I made mistakes everywhere. I made mistakes. I had no idea. I made mistakes in language. Somebody's mother died, and I said, "I'm so sorry." And they looked and say, "Why? Did you kill her?" You know, they're just different ways to express yourself. And just another quick example: modesty. If I said, you know, my dad, I'm really proud of my dad. He was a very successful accountant. People would just stare at you, because he's my in-group. I do not brag or boast about my in-group. That's considered bragging about myself. So I have to learn to downplay everything. When I came back from Japan, speaking of reverse culture shock, people thought I had very low self-esteem. I remember meeting a young lady at a party, and I was much younger. And I thought we were hitting it off. I thought it was great. And she said, "Oh, I saw you were in Japan. I hear your Japanese is really good." No. "Oh, my friend tells me you're really good at, you know, basketball." No. "Oh, you won this." "Oh, I was lucky." And I was going to ask her for her phone number about an hour later. And she said, "You know, John, you have a lot going for you, but you really need to work on your self-esteem." And I realized at that point that, you know, she didn't get it, or I didn't get my own culture, right? And, you know, which kind of brings us to figuring what can I say about myself without bragging, right? What is that humble brag? I can say, you know, I was, I like basketball, but, you know, and I played pretty well in high school, but I couldn't make the college team, right? So I played college ball, but, you know, I never made the cut beyond that. So you're always talking about, I did this, but something befell me, right? So it's a very different way, as opposed to Japan, you just deflect every compliment. Or in Chinese, you say nali, right? If somebody compliments you. So there's a lot of these adjustments, I suppose, back and forth. You know, I hope I'm not going off on too many tangents, but did I get at some of what you asked originally? Or?
Yeah, most definitely. Thanks.
Again, shut me up if I go too long.
I want to jump in a sense with this, because before we started our Confucius Institute, I knew very little about China, like many Americans. And when I heard about the Confucius Institute, I took a plane down to Houston to try to convince the consulate to accept our application. And I remember sitting down with the consul and telling him how we were going to just create a great Confucius Institute. It was going to be so wonderful, and we were going to base it on translation, and just, you know how we do, we Americans. And I went back and talked to my Chinese friend who had invited me to the dinner that caused my trip to Houston, and explained what I said, and he said, "They must have found you very amusing." And learned from, not just from going to China, but from making friends with Chinese coming to America. And my friends, just your point, John, that it's important to understand the lens through which the other is looking at reality. And I think we Americans, I keep discovering, have this notion that our way's the best, and every other way is a deviation from the best. And that's what the last 13 years helped teach me. I don't know if the others have found that too. I'll turn it back to you.
To me, I'm going to deflect this. I haven't heard from some other people, so Lauren or Iris, if you want to talk, please chime in. You're muted, Lauren, as are you, Iris. So you might want to make sure that you've got your microphone on when you decide to talk. But yes, I just to your question, Dennis, is I would say, I mean, yes, you do have to become very aware of how other people see you. And maybe you become a little bit too conscientious over time, right? Worrying about, what are they thinking? And you can start to sort of overdo it after a while, overanalyze what a particular culture is or what they expect of you. So, there's a lot of growing pains. There are people who I see a lot of, for example, women from Asia who will come here and say, well, American women are outgoing and they're aggressive. And so sometimes they become more aggressive than what we're used to in the US and start asking, boys out on dates that are a little bit, surprised to see that sort of thing. So there can be an overcompensation in terms of what you expect the other people to, expect of you. So it becomes sort of a weird game of sort of checking where you are and imagining where other people are and trying to figure out where you can go until you just finally feel a little bit more natural in your skin in a particular culture.
Dr. Brender, I wanted to ask both you and Iris what each of your opinions and kind of experience with the concepts of guanxi, or kind of like social relationships, and face, like giving face or losing face. So there are expressions in Chinese like 丢脸, which is kind of like to lose face, which is an example of like an embarrassing moment. And then there's 给面子, which is to give face. So if either of you have any kind of experience with that directly, and like what your experience is. I have a lot of experience of losing face, for sure, but also kind of recovering from it. And in a way, giving face is kind of like showing personal respect to somebody, sometimes in public, sometimes in private, in a friendship or business or what have you.
I mean, I personally have not come to terms with the whole mienza, with the idea of face. I find it's interesting in the sense that I like the idea of trying to give someone face, singing their praises, and I've tried to become more cognizant of that sort of thing since I've come back to the US, great question, and, that kind of a thing. I see face is a little dangerous sometimes, getting people into trouble. And I think we see that manifested in the sense that, in the US, we tend to have a little bit less hierarchy, a little less power distance. So if I have a problem that's really concerning, I'm likely to go to my boss and let them know. Whereas in China, a lot of people will try to just sort of suppress it. They don't want to tell the boss that some problem has happened. And as a result, sometimes the problem can get out of hand. Because of this, this mienza, like, what do you mean there's a problem? You were not taking care of something. You're never going to, to go up the ladder and be promoted and so on. So there's almost a danger to that in some respects, and in some situations can be much more dangerous than others, and some are maybe more benign. But I think the whole idea of the mienza, to me, has been a little bit problematic. Also, when I lecture at a Chinese university, I will tell them, I'm an American professor. Ask me any question you want. If you can stump me, that's great. I'm going to give you extra points, okay? I consider that great. That means you have, you're thinking. Do not worry about embarrassing me. I ask you to do that, right? Find a question I cannot answer. That's what this is about. It's give and take, because I do not know everything about any given subject. So that kind of thing is a little bit odd, because I know that, Chinese and Japanese students will refrain from asking a question because they don't want to embarrass the teacher. But I think it's important, just for me, my own choice after evaluating, the spectrum of Mienza. I find it dangerous, and I say no. I'm not going to set myself so high that I'm going to fall down. I'm just going to stay right down here and let people attack me, and like Socrates, just take the questions. And if I can't answer, then good for you. Okay, you've asked something that we're both going to learn from. And I hate to be ethnocentric in that respect, but when it comes to Mienza, I have my opinions. And Iris, maybe you can respond. Give me a rebuttal, please. Like I say, make me lose face.
I will try my best to do that.
Please.
I think I do have a different perspective on Mienza, because I am a student, so I am automatically a little lower than a professor. So I think I will be.
Not this professor.
I will be conscious to not embarrass the other people, especially they're older. I still have this either a problem or a habit. Let me rather say there's the passive acceptance topic. So I think. So what I personally do, partly because my education in the U.S., is that I will make sure that I myself don't put my Mienza too upfront. I don't care about this too much, so that I feel embarrassed to ask questions or to speak up. I don't do that personally, but at the same time, I need to be aware of the other people. They might be a little different, and it might not be that it's wrong. It could be just different, quote unquote, from the quote that you were just sharing. So I think it is quite important to see probably what is the value that is behind this Mienza concept. So I'll probably focus more on like the hierarchy. If I'm speaking to my grandfather and he has this point that I just absolutely don't agree with, I will probably use careful words to say, Grandpa, probably this thing, can we examine this a little more? But I probably want to say I don't agree with you. So this is a matter of expression rather than, a straight out attitude. If I don't say this, I lose face. I think it teaches us somehow to be more subtle with our expressions or our communications. I think it can be a good consideration to any extent to help you to become more sophisticated and, subtle.
I think there's a spectrum, and on the other end is somebody who says wrong, Dad, and kind of goes at somebody rather aggressively. I mean, there are polite ways of disagreeing with someone. I suppose for myself, and though I don't consider myself religious, I think it's important to look to some of the teachings about pride, and saying, of all the sins, pride is the worst, or, the hubris is what brings somebody down. So I personally, do not want to concern myself with my face. I will be happy to give you face, but I'm not going to make face my own priority. And I think it's a very dangerous thing, because I see people pretending to know things that they don't. And, as we say, I don't want to be that guy, right?
I absolutely agree on this point.
You're not saying that to give me face, are you?
Oh, no, not this time.
Other topics of conversation that...
Let me ask a question again, and I'd like to invite those of you who are tuned in and, like me, just lurking behind, really directed to Iris first, because I'd like to know, for someone coming from Asia to the United States to live, and anyone else can answer this who's in the audience, what are the two or three most annoying or confusing things that you found practiced by Americans?
I think it is hard to think about two or three things just on the top of my mind, but I can think of one for now. So I think it comes more in class discussion because I'm a literature major student. So I have a lot of, text-based discussion in class. And I noticed this thing. So we talk about active listening and then to let other people finish first. But then in some classes, I'm not saying for all classes, for some classes, if I wait for the other people to, finish their points, I might not get a chance to speak at all. So that's something that annoyed me a little bit. So do I be respectful or do I just get to my point and, take responsibility for my own point? So that is one thing that I can think of on the top of my mind. Oh, and then second, probably is if you can excuse me for saying this, the overusage for affection. For example, like people would say, I love you as a way of saying goodbye. So I think in China, we have this very deep concept of love. Like my father rarely says, I love you to me. So, but if he says, I love you, I know that it is deep. What he means, I love you, he really means it. So I think this is the second point that kind of annoyed me, but I do understand and I appreciate this warmth. But I just sometimes doubt the depth of this I love you. Yeah, those are the two I think of.
Others join in. Love your answer. Anyway,
if I could say something that just triggered a memory about the whole love, right? I'm from a very British American family that, we don't even have a term British American, right? Because it's sort of expected. But I have a family that, they don't allow us to cry at funerals, and there's not a lot of outward affection. It's, everything is on a scale of 1 to 10. We keep it from 4 to 6 at the most, right? Okay. So in terms of that, I love you, right? My parents on a rare occasion might say it, but for example, we would always, a British guy explained this to me when I was in England in 2004. He said, the average British person is much too shy or embarrassed to say things outright. So if you want to express that I love you, right, I'm not going to look you directly in the eye and say, oh, you mean the world to me, Iris. I couldn't live without you. Your friendship is everything, right? And if I were angry, conversely, I'm not going to say, I hate you, get out of here, get out of my life, right? So there's always some way that you change the tone of your voice with the words you're saying, right? So I could kind of say, oh, I love you, Iris, right? I could say it in a sarcastic way, and then it's okay. Neither of us is embarrassed. Or if I'm kind of mad, I could just kind of look affectionately and say, I hate you, right? So there's this way of checking the words with the way that they're delivered, right? Because, coming from a very Anglo background, saying something directly and meaningful is difficult. And if I could share one other thing, I always think it's funny when I go to China and you toast someone, right? I can look directly into the eyes of any Chinese woman, any Chinese man, or an American woman. But two heterosexual American men cannot look into each other's eyes, at least not from my generation, without breaking down laughing, because when you hold that eye contact, you have to either fight or kiss. There's just no happy medium. It's just completely uncomfortable for two American men generally to look into each other's eyes. But I can do it with a Chinese person, right? And I find that really interesting.
By the
so
way,
you do have your affections that we don't, okay?
I have to report that Lauren's microphone seems to be broken. And so she'll answer on the chat.
Oh, I can talk. I just kept it off while y'all were talking, so I can answer anytime. So.
Okay.
For sure.
So if anything, cultural shock is all about cultural awareness. Right? Like,
right.
I think so, yes.
Being a stranger in a foreign land, whether you just arrived or you're learning the culture or you're just coming back and you're getting that so-called reverse culture shock. I think reverse culture shock is equally kind of like, it's exhilarating, but it's also annoying. Because like when I came back from China, I was kind of anti-fork and I wanted to use chopsticks all the time. And I just got annoyed at the kind of like simplistic ways, my opinion, simplistic ways of Americans expressing opinions, that kind of direct use of language. And in China, I think language, as Dr. Brender said, is inextricably linked to culture, just in terms of, here's an example actually, like with certain idioms, idioms that are kind of a shorthand way of, expressing a large idea. So if you were to say in English, it's like talking to a brick wall, kind of like you are gonna say that in Chinese, but you wouldn't say talking to a brick wall. And if you didn't know the correct idiom, 对牛弹琴, which is kind of like literally
means, for a cow.
Yeah, playing a violin or playing, any kind of musical instrument for a cow. It's basically you don't know your audience. Another one is in English, when in Rome, ... Or like when in Rome, do as the Romans do. What is that in Chinese, Iris? 入乡随俗.
Oh, I honestly didn't know about that idiom.
入乡随俗 is like when you go into a countryside, follow their customs. So I honestly found that a lot of idioms have to do with kind of countryside living, whether it's cows or being a Roman and you're in Rome. I don't know. It's funny, and it's very entertaining, at the same time maddening to be, entering something so strange. And if anyone has read L'Étranger, which in French is The Stranger by Albert Camus, it's also about, not China, but it's also about, being in a kind of expat situation where he's French, but he's in Algeria, and he's like, well, he's in trouble for the law, but that kind of cultural queasiness, if that makes any sense to anyone.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned like reverse culture shock, because I feel like I can't remember too many like culture shocks when I moved to Japan, but I do remember a lot from when I moved back to the US, mainly because like I think it had a lot to do with like my age when I moved to Japan was kind of like at this like coming of age like part of my life where like I left the mainland at like 17, 18 and studied in Hawaii for 2 years and then straight to Japan for 3-4 years. And like I got my first apartment in Japan, or like I, started going to the doctor without like my parents in Japan, and like stuff you do as like an adult. And like other things like starting to work and all sorts of like kind of like adult things. But I remember coming back to America and realizing I don't know how to do like anything. Like all this seems so different to me. Like I remember the first time I went to the doctor, like after being in Japan so long, they're asking me all sorts of like insurance type questions. So like insurance in Japan is like socialized. So like I remember the doctor asking me, I was by myself because like I just had been used to going at that point by myself to the doctor. And I remember the doctor being like, oh, saying all these words, like, what's your like copay, or like, what's all these things? I'm like, I don't know how this works. Like, I had to ask my friends, like, how does like, insurance and stuff like that work here? Like, this is just so bizarre. So like, it felt like I had to relearn how to be an adult again. Like it was crazy. So it was very strange.
I wanted to mention that when I came back from Japan, and maybe you can relate to this, is I was overly polite.
Yes. And
you're taught to be tentative about everything. If somebody says, what's the capital of Sweden? You don't just say Stockholm, right? You have to say ano, eto, anone, tone, and you have to sort of be tentative, and you're extra polite, and especially in the Kanto region, if you're like around Tokyo or Yokohama. And I can remember being on the phone and my mother said, speak up, you sound like a sissy. It's because I was so polite and thank you, sorry, oh, and I'm sorry for breathing in your space. It's everything is shitsureshimasu, sumimasen, and you're just constantly begging somebody's pardon. But in the States, you have to kind of learn to reassert yourself in a lot of ways. And I see people come back from Japan and I just want to smack them because I've been there before. It's like, come on, get out of it. Reassert yourself.
Right, for sure. Yeah, I definitely like felt like that as well when I came back. Because like I feel like in Japan you become so aware of you know, like your in group and your out group and where you like whatever whoever you're speaking with, how are they in relation to you so that you can modify your speech and like in regards to you know talking about yourself and them. And so it's just a lot. And when I came back, it was just so crazy to kind of like have that mentality and all of a sudden it doesn't super matter like that anymore. So yeah, it's interesting what your brain kind of goes through.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
We have a question. We have a statement from the audience. This is from Professor Bei Chen, who is our Chinese professor, and she apologizes that her mic isn't working. So she's asking questions on the chat. Quote, I'm teaching Chinese at UTD. I wonder if you have any tips for our students who are learning Chinese, and do you have any tips for professors who are teaching Chinese? And I direct that obviously to John, but also to Iris, about because you've learned English rather brilliantly. And are there tips for people who are learning a foreign language, specifically Chinese?
Oh my gosh. It's definitely, I mean, in the classroom, one of the conclusions that I have in my book on language learning, and I have a whole chapter on, you know, being a wonk in language, but most people said that in the States, they might get a nice foundation. But once they get to China, it's just shock. Like, I don't understand a thing, especially what they're saying in Wuhan, because all the sh is s and all the, you know, j is z, and, you know, the L's are N's and the N's are L's. And suddenly they don't understand what's going on. It's all too fast. And they're going to eventually, you know, sink or swim once they get there. Language is something that another person doesn't really teach you. I mean, they do to some extent. They kind of get you, they give you the water wings, then you have to make it across the river. But, you know, I think it's important to put things into perspective. Nobody's going to walk out of your class and speak perfect Chinese, but you can give them what they need, the tools they need to get to the next step. And the other thing is, as a Chinese teacher, you probably need to get used to the repartee, the back and forth as much as possible. You can't be a sage on the stage and just talk the whole while. So the more interactive you can make the class, the better. But, you know, we say, I don't know what the Chinese translation of this is, but you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink it. 知道吗? So, you know, as a teacher, we take them so far. And those who really want to learn will learn and get it, right? So get them the basics, the grammar, the pronunciation, all that basic stuff. But to become really fluent, I'm convinced you really need to live somewhere or have a lot of interaction, right? You
in
can't
Chinese,
in any
called,
language.
Yeah. In Chinese, that's called 师傅领进门，修行在个人.
All right, I'm going to take your word for that, Sharon.
Sharon, can you explain that idiom?
That's just what John said. Means
Is
a
it
master.
a literal translation of the horse?
Later translation. Okay. Later translation is your mentor, your master, take you to a place, but whether you can become something is up to you.
That's clearer than the horse thing.
That's a masterful and literal translation. I've experienced both as a high school Chinese teacher to Americans in the private school settings, like in a boarding school, but also more importantly, I think, as a previous and ongoing second language learner of Mandarin. Some tips both to students and to teachers and professors is patience, practice, and also exposure to real native speakers, whether it's traveling to China or any country, you know, whether you're learning French and you want to go to Montreal or Quebec, which is much closer than France, or Spanish and you go to Mexico or anything. But I think with Mandarin, exposure, not just to like restaurants and like how to use chopsticks and kind of get empty compliments from the waiter that you use them so well, but really just to like get language exchange partners, as I've done myself, and Dr. Kratz and Sharon have all been on board with me getting my Chinese back up from its rusty kind of level right now, and looking also at the broader picture of why are we learning Chinese and what is our goal. You need a goal, honestly, to get to a level and proficiency level, and what does that look like? What are the can-do statements in a curriculum? What can I do now, and what do I want to be able to do? Is it like a simple transaction? Where's the toilet? I can get a room at a hotel. That's not fluency. That's fluency in a certain context, and it might contain fluid grammatical structures and certain basic vocabulary. But then as you go up in the proficiency levels and you're achieving more vocabulary, more subject matter, that might be out of reach for, or not even necessarily in need of being in reach for certain language learners. So I think teachers shouldn't be discouraged by stagnant learning or slower learning. Everyone learns at their own pace, but honestly, it's exposure and practice I think are the most important.
I hear everything and echo everything that you're saying, Noah. I wanted to add also that a lot of my respondents pointed that on the way to those goals are quests. And so I had a lot of people say that they would purposely put themselves into weird situations. Like one student said he would go to the department store and talk to the really bored salespeople about a refrigerator that they're selling, and to start asking all these bizarre questions about refrigerators, right? Or they would take the train to the night market and recommend just going alone, because if you're with another foreigner, people aren't going to interrupt you. But if they see that you're the only foreigner, they'll come up and start talking to you and say weird things and ask you weird questions and things like that, and you have to defend yourself. So putting yourself in odd situations and, and proving to yourself that you can make out. Too. What's that?
You get free practice.
Exactly. You're muted.
Excuse me. Yeah, you don't necessarily need a Chinese girlfriend or boyfriend or wife or husband or any kind of business relationship. When in China, even in Chinatown, in stateside, you can chat up anyone, and after the initial shock of like, wow, 你的中文讲得太好了, and they're like, your Chinese is so good. You're like, that's BS. It's not. But thanks for the empty compliment. And then move on. You'd be like, actually, I am learning Chinese, and I'm really struggling with XYZ facets of, pronunciation or tones, or how do I get better at writing? And then YouTube. There's a lot of YouTube goodness out there for language learners. Just whether it's kids, and what I used to do was high school teaching, or older.
We have a question from the chat, which brings up a subject. This is from a dear friend, Susan Chiswick. She said, learning to play a fast-paced card game impressed my Japanese neighbors way beyond my normal awkward speaking ability. The question she raises is the difference in games and play and what someone does for amusement in China, Japan, as opposed to the U.S., and what it can teach you. Iris, or do you play different games here?
Oh, yeah, I think we do have different games. And I think, yeah, I think Miss Susan definitely raised such a wonderful comment. It's definitely true. Not just to get face, but it's really true. So in China, I think what is now on a trend is what is called a scenario game, where you assign roles. So kind of like Among Us, where you assign roles, and then there is the imposter, and then you try to kill other people, and other people try to survive and to point out who's the imposter. So I think that's a great way of learning Chinese as well. So probably kind of tying back to the first question from Professor Chen is learning language through playing games. That is definitely true. And that, for me, it not just fosters language learning, it fosters friendship. For me, when I was here, I started playing Uno with my friends. I didn't know Uno in China. So it's my first exposure in the US. And then, yeah, I kind of learned like how to listen for the game rules and to abide for the rules. And then at the same time, I can be a little out of rules if it is okay. So I think it's such a pleasurable experience playing games, definitely.
Yeah, one of the games I like to play with my Japanese friends was a game called Shiritori. So it's like a verbal game where you would say a word in Japanese, and the end of that word would have to be what the next person says to start off. And so you would just go with however many people, but it was always a great way to like practice vocab you already know, but also hear what your your friends, like words that they can think of. And it was a great way to just like, if we were like on the train or on the bus and there wasn't, any other, like we couldn't really have a conversation, it's like, oh, like let's play Shiritori. And so that's a great practice for Japanese students, I think.
Yeah, for China it's true too. Like 入乡随俗 and starting with 俗不可耐 and 耐 something like that. So yeah, same game.
Right.
成语接龙.
One of the best pieces of advice I'd heard about for language is don't learn the language just to learn the language. Learn the language as a tool or a vehicle to learn something else. So if you're learning Chinese, learn Chinese plus comic books or Chinese plus drag car racing, whatever it happens to be, whatever your passion is, those are the people who learn well. The people who go to a country to study medicine, to study something specific are the ones who are really going to pick up the language without even realizing in many respects. So, sure, we need to know what an adverb is and things like that, but, get yourself to where you want to go and follow your passion.
What about to address those who are stagnating in their language and or feel guilty that they think they're stagnating?
Yeah, I have the whole section on pitfalls in my book, and people they get to a point, their plateau, they can kind of do what they need to, order food, use a transportation system, and then they start to get lazy, right? So you really, in fact, some people had said that by isolating themselves from other foreigners is oftentimes the best way to make it to the next level. There was one student who was in Wuhan and had plenty of access to other foreigners. He moved to Hefei, and suddenly, he's the only foreigner, and he has to, make himself understood in every situation. And I can tell you, living in Saitama in Japan in 1984, I was the only person who looked like me, so that if I looked in the mirror, I would like scream. It was, that unusual. So, being isolated from others, just long enough to where you don't quite go insane, right? And then you kind of meet some of your countrymen. But yeah, periods of isolation from speaking your own native language, I think is very helpful to get to the next level.
I think another area that we can probably think about is the pop culture. Because for me, if I just come here to stay in the classroom and to study whatever is on the table, whatever's in the textbook, then that wouldn't do much good to me. So for me, when I really got my greatest growth in English is when I go to like parties, not like those crazy parties, on a safety basis, go to parties, and then just to know what is live versus what is the book. So I think the pop culture is definitely a part of that nation's, at least the current of that nation.
Here's a Another chat, and this is from Professor Bei Chen again. I also feel that Chinese like to correct every error that a non-native speaker makes, but an English-French professor or French professor will more likely let the students finish their speech and ignore the minor errors, at least from my experience. It happened to me too, and I'm still trying to stop myself from interrupting students. Perhaps it's a habit of older generation. I wonder if you felt that yourselves, and she ends it, laugh out loud.
Well, as somebody who's spent too many hours teaching foreign languages in the classroom, I think it's important to find the balance, you know, where you can't jump on them for if you jump on them for everything, they'll lose confidence. If you don't correct them ever, they're going to, you know, fossilize some bad habits. So, you know, you sort of have to find that, you know, happy medium along that spectrum to allow the person to express themselves. And if you hear them make the mistake multiple times, and you can kind of bring it out without embarrassing the person. And sometimes you just correct if they say something like, 我是很好. You say, 你很好吗, right? So without the sure, but I'm not correcting them and say, no, never say sure before an adjective, right? So sometimes just repeating something back in a correct way also helps with the mienza, right? But, you know, there are a lot of different ways to sort of model things as you teach a foreign language. And, you know, neither extreme is good, right?
Did you ever feel that being different was actually a good thing? Like sometimes being the only American in a group of Chinese friends was kind of gave you faith. Like it was kind of like the cool factor. And on the contrary, that being one of many Americans or Westerners or Western males or whatever, kind of felt like a downer, like in social situations.
I can definitely see that more in China in a lot of respects, possibly than in Japan. I don't know. Lauren, do you have any thoughts on that?
I definitely, I definitely feel that. When I first moved to Japan, I kind of like what we were saying earlier, like I was definitely one of those foreigners that I was like, I'm not going to have foreign friends. Like I'm not, you know, I only have a set amount of time here, so I'm going to try to make the best I can do. So, you know, like I didn't live in this foreign dorms or anything. I joined a club, one of my college clubs, so like they can be quite serious over there. So it was one of those things where like I think at first it was kind of a learning curve in a way, but at least in Japan, once you kind of like find your group, you kind of become like you are like their foreigner. So it kind of like felt like a sense of belonging in a way where they definitely accepted me after, you know, after putting in a lot of effort. So, but on the other side of the question where it's like being in a group of like other foreigners, I never really felt it was much of a downer per se, but like I definitely always try to like, if I was with a group of other foreigners who couldn't speak Japanese, I always tried, you know, I was like, oh, this is a great opportunity to like practice for me, because like I can, you know, talk to whatever situation we're in and like help like our group out. So, you know, like I thought it was a great opportunity for, you know, both ways practice.
We have another chat. This is to me a very interesting question. This is from somebody who's at a higher level of language interaction. Annie Zhu says, a particular thing I struggle with as a language learner is being fluent enough in the language to have daily conversations with foreigners at a near native level, but yet not knowing how to dive deeper into idioms, depth, and particular nuances of the language that native speakers usually grow up simply knowing, like Captain Kangaroo, while foreigners have to learn explicitly. This applies to both Chinese and Japanese in regards to cultural nuances of respect, hierarchy, face, degrees of emotions, and many other aspects. So how can we As an English speaker with Chinese who are becoming more and more fluent in English, and as a corollary for a Chinese who's helping people learning Chinese to be better, how do you get people to the nuanced stage, to this deeper level of understanding?
I have a catalyst that I have to share. I had a colleague, my vice director while I was at the Confucius Institute, who I introduced to a book called Stuff White People Like. Has anybody heard of that? And it's really humorous. It's by this guy named Christian Landon, and I mean, he gets right down to the point where it's just embarrassing to be a white person, right? All the kinds of things that the white people like, and it is just filled with cultural nuance. And so my colleague would read through these, and she would just have tons and tons of questions. So, you know, every day we'd have 15 minutes or so to talk, maybe over lunch, and she would just go over her list of questions about, you know, what does this mean and why is this funny, and so on and so forth. So definitely, as you're coming into English, humor is, every Chinese tells me, humor is just so much more a part of our culture. It's fundamental, and it's really difficult to convey sometimes. But I personally enjoyed trying to figure out what some of those nuances were and why it would, you know, just receive crickets with the Chinese audience, right? And by the way, crickets, do you know that, Iris? I'm going to test you and put you on the spot and make you lose Mienza. If I say crickets.
Exactly.
Right. So if you hear nothing, you hear the sound of crickets, right? Chirping. So if I ask a question and nobody can answer, nobody responds to my joke, I say crickets.
Oh.
So that's an example of an idiom, right? That I would not expect you to know. But you're not going to forget it, right? So.
I think with language expertise in foreign languages and world languages comes nuanced level of native. I mean, it's called native language because if you're a native, then you speak it with the assumption that you have that inherent cultural awareness. I try not to be too hard on myself or on my students for not achieving that nuanced level of native fluency, because that's not the assumption. I think there's a beauty in being kind of different, that you bring that difference to the table, to the cultural table, you know, both kind of physically, literally, but also culturally speaking. So it's important to be open to, you know, to learning the particular nuances of the language, but it's not like you should be too hard on yourself. Like, oh my God, Wuxiang Suisu, or like, Dunyo Tanqin. I don't know that, so I'm an idiot, or I don't know that, so I'm not culturally aware enough about China. So that means I'm not good enough in the Chinese language. So I think it's very important, but it's not something that you should like bang your head, you know, be super kind of strict about, you know. And I think honestly, exposure to native language speakers is probably the fastest vehicle to getting nuanced levels of native proficiency. But other than that, it's just kind of, it comes with time.
Yeah, that was kind of something that I was going to say. Like, I feel like those types of things are really just, you have to pick up from like observation, like seeing how native speakers use nuance or how they respond to certain things. And like after, you know, making that observations over time, like I think that paired with just asking questions like, oh, like, what do you mean by that? Like, oh, when this person said this, what did they like mean by that? And asking like a native source and then having them explain that to me has been like very helpful, because like once you get to the level to where you can hear it and like, but you're like, I don't quite understand what they mean by that, you know, you can start to be like asking questions and just being, you know, in that kind of way.
Lauren, did they have Nihongo notes when you were there? Are you familiar with that series?
Nihongo notes. I don't think so. Is it a book series or?
It was, I want to say it was done by Kodansha, but they would have this, I don't know how many volumes of books, where Mr. Learner is always going into a Japanese situation and he's making a mistake. And then they explain why he made the mistake and why this was, wrong and so on and so forth. So, a lot of these things are documented and you can try to learn from Mr. Learner and his mistakes. But, we're never going to be native speakers, especially between East and West. I'm amazed when I meet somebody from Scandinavia who speaks English so well and they've seen every Friends episode and, they can talk shop about, all sorts of different things. But there's definitely a bigger gap with East Asians, for example, who don't have quite the same exposure to American, British, history, drama, television, so on and so forth.
Right.
And likewise us, we're clueless, we can get so far, but, like you say, Noah, we can't be that hard on ourselves, right? You can communicate, and I can forgive myself in Spanish for not, knowing about any allusions to 1970s Argentinian politics, right? I just can't know everything. I'm sorry, I can't. So.
Like, I'm still learning about all the nuances. I'll talk to professors. Dr. Kress is one of the after class and saying, oh, this nuance, I'm not sure I understood it. Can you explain a little more about it? So I think definitely, like Noah said, don't get too hard on yourself again. And then it comes with time. So I'm still in that learning mode. I'm still learning. And I don't think it's a bad thing. And to some extent, it kind of reminds me even of my identity. This ignorance reminds me of my identity. So I think it's kind of a strange gift that I don't know everything. So probably think of it in this lens.
In China, I've had several conversations that reminded me of the truism about the United States and Britain. I think it was Winston Churchill said that we're two nations divided by a common language. And if you're a translator, you look and you see if the book has been translated into British English or American English. Most of the people I deal with in China speak fluent English. And yet, if you have a long conversation, you realize that you learn a lot. They're speaking English from a Chinese frame of mind. And you're speaking English from an American frame of mind. That's what I'm listening to, and I'm hearing the most useful aspect of your conversation. It's not the words. It's we call it the social imaginary, the complex of assumptions about what's normal and what's not that come out translated into words. And if we can, as you said, John, it's not learning the language, it's learning the mindset. I've been very fortunate. Whenever I'm in China, I make lots of mistakes. And I think that's the most useful thing to do, because people love to correct the mistakes in a kindly way in China and say, here's how you could have done it better. Okay. And as an American with people from other lands, that's how I try to do it now. Say, good try. Here's how you could come a little closer, rather than wrong, as you were saying.
A question for those that are new to traveling abroad into China, at what point would you say it's important to understand cultural nuances when learning language? Is it always important, or is it only important as you get into more advanced stages of the language, past just getting around town, transportation, basic ordering things, and past that, developing friendships and relationships, and then meeting your in-laws? when does it become more and more important to understand cultural nuance? And I'll give an example from my aunt, who, so my mother's sister is from France. My mom is from France, and she is on a translation consortium for books by what's his name? Roth, who wrote Patriarchy. Oh my God, I can't remember. Anyway, so some references are very American, and when translated from English into French, there are examples such as, this business plan really is going to hit a home run, which means to an American will be a huge success. But of course, to those who don't understand that home run, first of all, is a sports reference from baseball. And within baseball, home run is, like you're scoring a point. So, that's when cultural awareness and cultural nuance and pop culture, sports, everything become important. But is it important the whole time?
My answer, I have to say, Noah, in a word, is immediately. That you should start learning idioms from day one. One, because it'll amuse your, friends in the target language, right? When somebody just kind of whips out a, dueño tanchin kind of, idiom, like, oh, how did you know that, right? And plus, it gives you some idea of what's going on. So, I can't say enough about learning through idioms. A lot of times it helps me with the grammar because I can refer to how these sentences are put together and things of that sort. Of course, I'm never going to get to that point where, I know all the nuances, or I master first the pronunciation and work my way up to it. They're fun. They're telling about the culture, and they will help you with your grammar. So I say, pick up as many as you can randomly, because you're never going to be able to layer them all. But I they're helpful, they're fun, and they make people feel that you appreciate their culture when you say something that is, so very native to them, right? Like if somebody mentions an episode from Friends that you can relate to, like, oh my gosh, you're from Brazil. How is it that you know from season 2, episode 3, that this was, that this went on, and you feel like they're closer to you when they're able to relate on that level. So
we're word people. I'd like to bring the conversation, before we have to go, to other nuances of the nonverbal language. How hard, how important to be observant of those subtle changes. This is sort of language, but for example, I learned very early that it was a mistake to call on the third most important person in the room before I called on the first most important person. And space between people. Otherwise, Iris, did you have to learn a whole new nonverbal body language when you came to the States?
I don't remember a lot of nonverbal communication, but I do remember receiving a lot more hugs. So that's part of it. So I do have a little interesting story that I don't know whether or not it counts as nonverbal. So when I just came here, I thought Americans are quite strange, but not strange in that uncanny way, but kind of strange in a cute way. Because when I just came here, I remember it's a Valentine's Day, and then like a random person who has absolutely nothing to do with me gave me a bag of candy and told me Happy Valentine's Day, and I was freaked out. For a solid second, I was like wondering if there's a social experiment going on and there's a hidden camera somewhere recording my reaction. So I think, does it count as nonverbal? Perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I feel like, yeah, that was my initial moment of having. If I knew Dr. Press back then, I would have quoted him that's strange. And then after a little more exposure to this kind of strangeness, I thought, oh, that's kind of cute. And then after still a little more exposure to that, I will probably want to join them. Probably sending virtual flowers to my friends in China in Valentine's Day, and they will probably not thinking I'm crazy or something, but it's okay. I understand them for not understanding me. So I kind of got off topic.
Yeah.
That anyhow answers the question.
I wanted to give an example of the nonverbal, and at the risk of people thinking even less of me than they do now. When I was in Japan back and I was in my early 20s, and Lauren will attest to this, that in Japan you cannot really say no. I mean, unless you're higher level than somebody, you don't say no. So I was with a group of Americans and Japanese together, and just to kind of be the instigator that I am, I said to my American friends, watch, I'm going to ask Ri-chan an impossible proposition, and she will not say no to me. So I asked her in Japanese, and she had a boyfriend and so on, and I said, Ri-chan, would you like to go to Mount Fuji with me this weekend? And she said, I'd like to go, but I said, no, yes or no? Do you want to go or not go? And she looked at me, I'd like to go, but I said, no, I don't understand. I want a yes, I want a no. And she would look at me even with fiercer eyebrows and like, I want to go, but I could not get her to say, I don't want to go, right? That just is not going to come out of her mouth. So, there's a lot of this eye stuff that goes on in Japan, and Americans will come back and say, oh, Japanese are liars, but they're not seeing the cues, because really there's no way that the Japanese person can say no in a polite context. They'll say, this is interesting, or we'll think about it. I think we understand each other. They have all these phrases, right? But you really have to cue into the eyes more than the words, especially in Japan. Now, China, I think the differences are far more subtle. We're much more alike than we are with the Japanese in that respect. So sorry, I just wanted to add that little tidbit. So.
Well, we're down close to the end, and I'd like to turn it to each of you to make a final observation of a way to help someone who's thinking about traveling to Japan or China or someplace else and stay for a while. What your advice would be, something to do or something to avoid, just to put you on the spot and you can't say no. Or you can say yes, but. Let me start with Lauren.
Okay. I guess for mine, my advice is, I heard this phrase. I think I'm pretty sure. I think it's a Buddhist phrase. I might be misattributing it, but it's like, the problem is we always think we have time, but we really don't. So I would say, try to use every opportunity that you get. You might not be able to do something or have an opportunity to do it again for a second time. So really try to use your time wisely. Don't be afraid to fail. I think making mistakes is great, so you can learn from it. And another thing that really helped me was try to remove all of your safety nets. Don't purposely put yourself into like difficult situations where like you're gonna have to struggle, because struggling will make you have to learn. So like, if that means only seeing your foreign friends once a week, like do it. Or if it means, not using the English menu, like really make yourself struggle. But yeah, and just enjoy it. Have a great time, and have fun.
Thank you. Noah.
Well, for starters, thank you for having me. And this has been really fun and like a warm reminder of my times in China and other places. But to those, going forward in travel plans, I would say have an open-minded mentality. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. And also, I think, just as an afterthought, use technology, wisely, like in a sense of for learning purposes. So, are there apps out there that help with, like idioms and, looking things up on the spot and, navigation and stuff like that. And always seeking out opportunities to improve your language skills proactively through friends and friend networks or meetups kind of things, and I think it was Susan who mentioned the dancing in Japan and finding hobbies that you can pursue in that home language, but not necessarily being hard on yourself when making mistakes and not, avoiding your own culture and kind of denying it and not trying to completely culturally assimilate yourself to the new land, but also being proud of your own culture and not kind of being that kind of like self-deprecating American or whatnot. So go forth and be curious.
Iris.
I'm gonna be short. So as a Chinese person myself, I would say a lot of Chinese people can actually speak English. So if you want to learn Chinese, make them to speak Chinese with you. don't let them speak English. Yeah, that's it from me.
Good point indeed. And finally, Dr. John Brender, before I give you the final word, thank you again for joining us, for being willing to hold this fireside chat, for your really insightful and valuable book that we've bought a number of copies of. And if anyone would like a copy, all you have to do is visit the Center for Asian Studies on the 5th floor of Johnson, and you'll get a copy of the book and an introduction to the work of the center. John, final words.
Oh boy, you guys took all the good stuff. But I think I would say that you need to find a balance. I mean, push yourself and work hard, but also be forgiving and be good to yourself. I mean, I would, for example, when I was in Japan, I might spend, 6 days with all my Japanese friends and colleagues, etc. But I would spend a Sunday with my Australian friend in Tokyo. And just because I needed to debrief, right, and talk to somebody from a similar culture and, talk about philosophy or things that I might not talk to, a Japanese person about. So, I mean, you need to strike that balance. You can't just become totally immersed without kind of going nuts. So give yourself a lifeline, but keep working.
Thank you all. Thank the participants for tuning in and asking questions, and take another language, learn another language, absorb another culture. To have two languages, to quote a famous saying, is to have two souls. Thank you, and we'll see you next week. The Center for Asian Studies next Thursday is presenting a major lecture by Professor Erica Lee, author of The Making of Asian America. Tune in at 6 p.m. next Thursday, and we'll send you the information. If you're interested, contact us. It's going to be an important event by the center. Thank you again, and good night, everyone.
Yes, thank you all so much.